Salve a tutti e benvenuti al primo appuntamento della nuova rubrica di Politica internazionale qui sul canale YouTube di Liberi Oltre le illusioni. In questa nuova rubrica approfondiremo temi collegati a recenti eventi internazionali e che si sono verificati sul palcoscenico politico internazionale in particolare, invitando, come nostro solito, esperti del settore. Quest'oggi affronteremo il tema del Myanmar, un tema abbastanza complicato come vedremo. Io sono Gabriele Fabozzi, già collaboratore di Liberi Oltre tramite la rassegna stampa quotidiana, ed in studio con me oggi c'è Georg Bauer. Buongiorno Georg.
Ciao,
Eh,
buongiorno a tutta l'Italia.
Georg è uno storico presso l'Università di Vienna, specializzato sul Myanmar, parla anche un po' di italiano, come avete potuto sentire, e il suo lavoro negli ultimi anni si è focalizzato non solo sulla storia della regione in generale, ma anche e soprattutto sui processi di state building che poi hanno portato alla formazione del moderno stato del Burma e poi quello che successivamente verrà chiamato Myanmar. Uhm, Oltre ad offrire un aggiornamento sui recenti eventi che hanno riacceso un po' l'interesse per il Myanmar nei media internazionali, cercheremo anche un po' di sviscerare il come si è arrivati a questo momento e quali sono le componenti di questa guerra civile che, come molti sapranno, ormai nella sua odierna fase prosegue da più di 2 anni e mezzo, anche se poi, come vedremo, in realtà è una cosa che va avanti da decenni. La conversazione sarà in inglese, ma, come molte delle nostre produzioni non in italiano, troverete tra le opzioni del video la possibilità di attivare sottotitoli in italiano o in inglese a vostro, piacimento. Detto ciò e senza ulteriori indugi, io farei partire la nostra sigla per poi affrontare questo, complesso tema, insieme a, Georg. So, here we're back. Georg, I wanted to, publicly thank you also for taking your precious time out of your schedule to help us comment the latest events that have been unfolding in Myanmar, but also in kind of understanding the complexity of the country from a geopolitical perspective. In my experience, it can be quite daunting for a layman or somebody who has simply just tuned into the news, as myself, let's say, to get a real grasp of what is going on, considering the troubled history of the country, the degree of internal division in the country on so many levels, political, ethnical, religious grounds. So again, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it is my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I haven't been on Italian media yet, so it's very good. Very good to be with you. And I'm glad that there is some attention on Myanmar and to your bringing
Absolutely,
light to it.
there's always there's a first time for everything. Let's say.
Yeah.
So I would say we can kick this off with recent events. As many of our listeners know, Myanmar has been engulfed in let's say, an acute phase of a civil war since February of 2021, when the country's military, the Tatmadaw thwarted all attempts of, say, construction of a democratic state with a coup d'etat. Well, we'll have a chance to go over the details of the war. Let's maybe start with recent events. Lately, over international media, we've had Myanmar kind of resurfacing to attention. And what's been going on lately in November and now into December?
Yeah, so with the end of October, specifically the 27th of October, an operation was started by several armed resistance groups, which they call Operation 1027, which is territorially more or less confined to the northeast, but not only. It started there to the northeast in the northern Shan states. The Shan state is a partial state of Myanmar, and the offensive started close to the Chinese border and at the Chinese border. And we have three ethnic armed or ethnic resistance organizations that have existed even before the coup. So we have a lot of different ethnicities in Myanmar. We'll talk about this later. And many of them, several dozens of them, have their own resistance groups. And so they have existed prior to the coup, but they have helped forge new resistance groups after the coup, which are not ethnically based in the same sense as they were. And in short, these three armies, together with some of the new ones like the Mandalay People's Defense Force. So the People's Defense Forces are these new groups. That's sort of an umbrella term, PDFs. They have started an offensive in this hilly region of the northern Shan states. And they have managed within very short time to conquer a lot of territory and hurt the military in a way that the military hasn't seen probably since the 50s or 60s. So in over half a century, they have lost, depending on how you count, between 200 and 300 outposts. Many of them are very small, so there are various degrees in what that means. But they have not only lost outposts and territory, they have also lost towns for the first time since the coup. So we have seen a gradual expansion of this military resistance to the junta, and they have now managed to take towns, so smaller cities, and crucially, a lot on the Chinese border. So there are very few towns left where the land trade between Myanmar and China, which goes into billions, of course, can flow. And since the end of October, this offensive has spread throughout the country. We have in the middle of November, on 11th November, a similar intensification of attacks against the military in the southeast, in the called the Karenni region, officially Kayam, but usually referred to as Karenni on the Thai border, which have also started to expand their operations. Karenni had been liberated almost entirely before already. It's a very small state, and they are now still battling for the state capital. So as we speak now, the battles are still going on. There are massive airstrikes against resistance, but about, I think, over half of the town has been already liberated. And also on the other side of the country, on the west of the country, in Rakhine State, which some of the listeners might know, this is where the Rohingya had been driven out. There had one of these three armies that I mentioned in the beginning, the Arakan army, that is actually based in the west or has its core in the west, has stepped up its operations there as well, and is liberating territory there. Although there it's been a bit more difficult because the military has kept a lot of forces there even throughout the last 2.5 years, because the Arakan army had a big offensive between 2018 and 20, and the military was always afraid of them. So the offensive was a bit slower there, but they have recently taken very important outposts, and I can show you later on a map what that change means.
Yeah, gladly. That would really help, because it's hard to get into the details without kind of understanding from a geographical perspective what the situation is. So you said Shan region, then Kayin region down in the south, and then in the West in Rakhine.
Yes.
So from what it seems from international, at least from reading from the international media, it seems that these groups have kind of always been fighting somehow for some sort of, if not outright independence, some sort of more pronounced autonomy from the central state. But it seems like this is the first time that they actually come together and put together a concerted effort, and both, let's say, politically and also on the ground when it comes to military operations.
Yes. So this is, it's not entirely correct. So the three armies that I mentioned at the beginning, which are, I just named them now. I know it's confusing. I'm trying to not use too many names because there are so many. But the three are the Arakan Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, the MNDAA, which is basically a ethnically Chinese, or Kokang, or they refer to, they speak Chinese, but belong to Myanmar, and the TNLA, the Ta'ang National Liberation Army. So these three groups that have existed before the coup, they were already in an alliance called the Three Brotherhood Alliance. So this alliance is not entirely new in that sense. What is a bit new is that they included these new troops like the Mandalay People's Defense Force, which is a very large and very professional force. They within 2 years built. We don't know the exact numbers, but probably over 5,000 troops under arms, very professionally organized, operating together with them, and so that is certainly a new aspect, that you have parts of the majority, ethnic majority population, the Bama, that live more in the center of the country, join these uprisings now. And this alliance, these gains that they could make, is not only due to the fact that they cooperated with these new groups, but also due to the fact, because we have seen this war basically over the last 2 years, weakening the military significantly. The military has, over the decades that it has fought, and the civil war has been raging actually since the modern unit of Burma was founded in 1948, when it became an independent state from the colonial power, which was the United Kingdom. There has been constant civil war. So, and the military has, especially in the last decades, always tried to fight only on one front at once. So they tried to make some sort of ceasefire agreement with one, say in the southeast, to focus on fighting in the north, and that has been reversed again in the past 10 years. But now, since the coup, everybody is fighting them, basically. A lot of groups that have not been fighting them, had been on ceasefire agreements for a decade or even 3 decades, have seen the ranks grow significantly with new recruits and with new funds from the population. And so they've been under pressure for 2 years, and this has slowly built up. And we see, in the beginning it was roadside bombs of these new groups, like IEDs, where they just attack a convoy, hit and run techniques. Now we are at the point where they manage to even attack towns, and that is the big change in the military matter. We also see, as you said, political cooperation. This is a bit more fragile in that sense, because it's much more difficult to achieve, right? You can maybe more easily decide on, okay, we need to militarily defeat the common enemy, but to agree upon what is to come after is, of course, a much more difficult question. And this is also the question that has been at the core of the civil war since the 1940s. And this is something that is being discussed in the background. Basically attempts to forge a new constitution that is based on democracy and federalism. So what you alluded to, when that these different ethnic groups are striving for more autonomy, is basically a sort of a federal structure of the country with a lot of autonomy for these different regions and ethnicities. But we will see how this unfolds, and whether they manage to get these talks going again in the near future.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this it seems like the question of federalism is central somehow to the Myanmar state. But so I understand that it was not. I mean, kind of, you have these different components who have been fighting for more autonomy, and some of them, you said, have been fighting since the late 40s, in 1948, when Myanmar gained its independence from from Great Britain. I think it would be useful if we could maybe go on, I say, do a small review of the history of Myanmar, at least from when it was an independent state, or maybe a bit before, but at least to give us the tools to understand the current situation, because it seems like the ethnic differences which are present somehow, from what I understand, are a kind of a product, are a post-colonial product somehow, or at least their clash at this level. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but
Yeah.
that's my understanding from the little reading the reading I've done, let's say.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and we will see how the question of federalism, the ethnic question, is also connected to the question of democracy and to the various military coups or military rule in Myanmar. But maybe I will start with a map that will help us hopefully understand the history and this ethnic diversity better. I'm using Google Maps here also just to locate Myanmar. So what we see here is Southeast Asia. This is mainland Southeast Asia. To the north we have China, to the west India and Bangladesh, and to the east Thailand and Laos. And if we zoom in a bit, we see that Myanmar or Burma, you can use both names, don't worry, neither one is particularly offensive, is that we have here in the middle the flatlands and around the main river of the country, the Irrawaddy River, that flows from the north, from the Himalayas, all the way down south to the Andaman Sea here in this vast delta region in the south. And around these plains in the middle, we have basically a horseshoe of mountains that you see going from the southwest, stretching up all the way to the north, and then going down again here all the way to the coastal line of the Tanintiri region. And the highest mountains, by the way, Kagaburazi here in the very northern tip of the Kachin state of Myanmar is over, I think, 5,800 meters high. So we have very high mountains, and this geography also tells us about the ethnic diversity in the country. And for that, I will show a different map. I have to switch the.
Yeah, this is a usual problem on these. On these screens. Okay, so a horseshoe outline. That's interesting. So I would understand why early settlers would choose the valley kind of as place to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing is, the valleys, of course, are very fertile because they are, and you have easier way to grow population because you have easier way to grow rice. So of course the population density in this areas is very very important and an advantage in let's say in more ancient history. This was basically what gave a king more power if he had more population.
Right.
And so here what we see now is a linguistic map of Myanmar, and keep in mind, of course, that this is not entirely 100% accurate. It's a map is always an approximation when it comes to these things. But what we see here is
sorry, could you zoom in slightly? Just to accent, yeah.
So
thank you.
What we see here, that roughly corresponding to what we saw in the topographical features, the center where you have yellow, bright yellow here, is where the majority population, the Burma, from which the country's name, Burma or Myanmar, is coming from, reside. And around that, in these hill regions, you have a big diversity of languages and ethnicities. And you can also see that they overlap in a lot of instances. So, for example, when you see this blue and brown here, between the Shan and the Kachin, this would often be that the Shan would be inhabiting the valleys and the Kachin would live up on the hills, have the villages higher up, and they would. So this is something that has been developing over centuries. And what we also have is an extreme diversity in language. It's not, many of the languages are not comprehensible, or not even from the same family. We basically have all three big language families from Southeast Asia, even to be found within Myanmar. So, for example, here the Mon Khmer language is related to what is spoken in today's Cambodia, whereas the Shan language is a Thai language, so more related to Thai, whereas the main language, Burmese, is a Tibeto-Burman language. And there are many different Tibeto-Burman languages that are also mutually not intelligible. So you could almost say it is like the Habsburg Empire in a way, linguistically. You have within a modern country today. So this gives you maybe helps us have an understanding. And this is, by the way, also not a map that shows that these populations often do not stop, of course, at today's modern borders, but many of them are cross-border groups that live, for example, here in the West, in today's India, which is quite important actually today for support of that of this region of India, which is Mizoram. So you have this, big diversity.
Yeah, it seems like it would definitely cause an interest from all neighboring countries. I mean, I see there's linguistic groups overlapping into Thailand, into China, of course, into Laos as well. So of course, I mean, from what you show here, it really seems like this reminds a bit of India somehow. It would seem like the federal form of state would suit itself, or would be probably advisable. What attempts have been made in this sense? Was this kind of, so let's say from independence, was this a plan which was already, or were early state builders of Myanmar already planning on a federal state, or was this was it realized afterwards that, all right, we can't agree on many things, let's aim for this somehow?
No, this was the basic idea of the formation of the modern Union of Myanmar, or modern Union of Burma at the time.
And you called it Union of Myanmar, so it's already in the name. There's
the union is already in the name, but all constitutions so far have been federal in the name only, and in appearance. They've never actually allowed for proper federal structures. So when we go back to the 40s, I have to start at least with the end of colonial rule. Colonial Burma, as it was ruled by the Brits, was ruled in different systems. You had in this, what we saw in the middle of the country with the majority population, you had direct rule by the Brits in what was called Burma proper, or ministerial Burma. And the highlands around it were ruled indirectly. So the Brits kept the local hierarchies, the local chiefs or princes in place, and ruled through them. So you had two different systems of government during British rule. And basically during colonial rule, different nationalisms, or the idea of nationalism in itself, came to Burma, as it came to so many other parts of the world. And it was the main mode of resistance against colonial rule, at least from the 1920s on. Not the only one, but I'll keep it short, and let's just say different nationalisms developed, and along the ethnic lines. So the nationalisms that developed were not a nationalism of everyone within colonial Burma, but rather ethno-nationalisms based on ethnic identity. And this was strengthened, especially during World War II, because the nationalists, the young nationalists of the Burma, they actually sided with Japan. So Japan invaded Burma in 1942 and brought along with them the Burma Independence Army. That was this was the start of what is today's what you refer to as the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military. It was founded by Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San. They went to Japan in 1941, him and the 30 comrades. And they invaded, and many of the other groups, so those who lived in the hills, stayed loyal to the Brits. So there was fighting between these groups from 1942 to 1945. In 1945, so Japan managed to occupy most of Burma, not the highlands, because the local population was very good at resisting. But in 1945, they switched sides and decided to kick out the Japanese because they didn't really give them the independence that was promised to them. And so the Brits and the Allied forces, Americans, returned from India and managed to, together with the local groups, to kick out the Japanese. And so, especially especially for the groups in the highlands, this was the time when they developed the national consciousness stronger, and talking to and cooperating with these foreign soldiers, these ideas manifested themselves stronger in them than before. And at the same time, we had these antagonisms. There were massacres committed, especially by the Burmese forces against the other ethnic groups, not only, but mainly. And so there was a big, even then we had a lot of trust issues between these groups. And there were a lot of voices that did not want to gain independence together with the Burmese. And to the 2 years, or not even 3 years, between 1945, when the Japanese were kicked out, and the return of the Brits, and independence in January 1948, were an extremely crucial time for this. And here, basically, there were different ideas of what could be the future. But in the end, as I would read the sources, the Brits, through their policy of not giving money to these hill regions, or not wanting to finance them in the future, made it impossible for these regions to declare some sort of independence, or stand on their own feet, because also like they were not really developed in infrastructural terms. You had no roads, you had very little, few schools, etc., no institutions. So, and to come to an end, there were negotiations between these different groups, and the most important ones were done in March 1947, February 1947, in the Second Panglong Conference, and there was the Panglong Agreement, which is often cited. And it was a very technical agreement, but it was the basis to where these leaders decided, okay, we would form a union, but everyone would be guaranteed autonomy. But when, during the summer months of this year, the actual constitution, to put this into legal form, was drafted, it became federal in appearance only, and it was actually a very centralized one, constitution. So starting from 1948, from independence, the first groups started to take up, or they already were under arms, but they started a resistance. And then there were the communists, which we might not talk too much about today, but for many decades they were, of course, a strong force. And over the next decade or so, you see more and more ethnic groups picking up arms because they were not content with the lack of federalism in the country. And this is where this stems from. And maybe I can take one more minute to connect this also to the military, because the military was taken over by Ne Win after 1948, and he was the commander-in-chief, and he was a strong nationalist, a Burma nationalist, and he was not very fond of the idea of federalism, and so he basically Burmanized the armed forces. So the high ranks were only open to this majority ethnic group and not to others. And he, in the late 50s, there was another push by ethnic leaders for a federalization of the constitution, and they were invited by the government. This was a parliamentary democracy, more or less, in the 50s, right? And the government invited them to a convention in the capital of Rangoon, which is today Yangon, and to debate this federalism issue. And on that day, the military staged its first permanent coup. So they stormed that meeting, they arrested the prime minister and all these leaders, and installed themselves basically for the coming decades as the government. And they cited this because they said federalism will break up the country. And this has been the ratio for military rule from day one, that federalism will destroy the country, and also they were very unhappy with the way democracy had been functioning during the 1950s. They saw it as something very chaotic. So they don't like parliamentary democracy as we understand it in Europe, and they don't like federalism, and that was the core of why they'd taken power.
Right, right. This seems to be a recurring theme in a lot of the declarations that a lot of people in the military in Burma say, and I don't know what you think, honestly, but I think there might be some generals who maybe genuinely believe that they are the only ones who can kind of keep the country together. But this seems to be definitely a hook that they use today to justify what's going on in the country right now. Somehow, that if they're not there, then the country will fall apart. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I've had many discussions, and it's hard to answer. Like, how much do they believe their own propaganda and narratives about the history, you know? And
Right.
I tend to believe that they believe it, or at least, you know, it depends on which general we're talking about. At the same time, a friend of mine, a Burmese friend of mine, says they are just mafia. Especially since the 90s. I mean, there was a change in the way that the military ruled the country from the Burmese way to socialism that they established in the 60s. That totally ruined the country's economy. And there was a new military junta from the 90s on, and then they enriched themselves massively. And these generals are extremely rich by now, and they're cronies. So that the whole economic life of the country is in the hands of the generals and the crony families. So it's a good question. Like, how much do they just use this as a pretext to stay in power? I guess both parts play a role, but I do
Right.
believe that they buy into their own propaganda. I would say that it is the military that risks the breakup of the country because they have never managed to settle. I mean, they've been in power for over half a century,
Right.
right, from 1962 on, and they have not managed to do anything good for the country. They ruined it economically, infrastructurally. Myanmar is almost pre-industrial. What we see, and when people visit, you see Yangon, which is at least a city. But if you go to the countryside, when I lived there in 2018 to 2020. I think 60% of the country were not connected to the national electric grid, right? So you have a vast rural population. I think at the time also we had an urbanization rate of only around 30%. So almost 3/4 of or 2/3 of the country lived on the countryside and lived off of agriculture, and mostly how do you call this? To self-sustain, not much cash crops.
Right.
So
The
mostly
subsistence economy. I think.
subsistence. Yes,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, the military has not achieved anything, and they have not managed to find any political agreements with anyone because they are not willing to do so. We had several attempts by them, or ostensible attempts, to talk to different resistance groups, but they have never signed any peace. They were always ceasefire agreements, never political concessions, and then they never have given any political concessions in a strong sense when it comes to the federalism issue.
Right. So much that you might, and I think you have read in some international media outlets as of lately, some have referred to Myanmar as a failed state, in the sense that you have this kind of overarching and persistent low intensity anarchy situation, which has been going on at this point for more than half a century, as you said.
Right. Although, if I may, I think some of these failed state comparisons are giving people wrong impressions because they think of other failed states.
Like
I don't know what they
Somalia,
would
for
think.
example,
Maybe
or
sorry.
Somalia, for example, could be an example.
Yeah.
Or
But I wouldn't say that comparison is entirely accurate, because while you have a lot of diverse groups that are fighting, the antagonism between the groups is relatively small compared to other parts. So you will find comparatively very little infighting between different ethnic groups. Like in Shan State, you have some actually between two Shan groups, but everyone is fighting the military in that sense. And and also everyone is at least in the general agreement to fight for the same goal. The details are of course complicated, and also so the country is not falling apart in that sense, I would say.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, let's talk about those details. And in particular, I was very interested in the religious aspect of the whole Myanmar equation. Since we're still talking about the process of state building, and you mentioned conflicts between ethnic groups, I wanted to bring up the topic of religion because I had two big questions. On the one hand, we've seen what has happened with the Rohingya some in the past years, and also in the last months. Actually, it's not often referred to in the news, but in the West, you've had tons of refugees going over into Bangladesh. So the country, from what I understand, is predominantly Buddhist, around 90% of the country, with some important religious minorities. There's Christians and there's Muslims. So let's say, what role has religion at least caused in terms of interethnic frictions? Because it seems like, despite what you said, from the outside it might seem like there actually is some tension on that front. And also, on a more broader term instead, what was the role of Buddhism in the birth of the Union of Myanmar, and how was that also a part of the nation building process, and how is it used today also as by the military as, I don't want to say as a weapon, but at least as a base of support inside the country?
Yeah, so maybe let's start with the second question, because it basically gives you a good underlying understanding of the country. As you correctly said, Myanmar is predominantly Buddhist, Theravada Buddhist, to be more exact. Of course, with every big religion you have different confessions, and Myanmar is a Theravada Buddhist country, which is a quite, let's say, conservative form, to put it in simple terms, of Buddhism. And it is very Buddhist in a sense, that Buddhism plays a very, very big role in most people's lives, or religion. Also, those who are not Buddhist, religion usually plays a very central part in people's lives. So you have a lot of people donate. It's a very poor country, yet they donate gold to monasteries. So if you might go to a village in the countryside, or you don't even have to go far, like just like half an hour outside Yangon, and you will have people that have no running water and maybe not even electricity, and it's very basic huts where they live in, and then the only part of the town that is built a bit better is the monastery, and there might even be gold on the stupa, on the stupa is this religious site,
temple,
basically. Yeah, it is part of the temple, or part of the pagoda.
Part of the temple.
The stupa is that pointy thing. I don't know how to properly describe it. But so a lot of money goes there because people are very spiritual, very religious. Interestingly, though, while it is very conservatively Buddhist, there is a syncretism with the previous animist beliefs. So you also still have the belief in the nuts, which is usually translated as spirits. And there are about 37 official nuts, which are like some sort of gods. And then the villages and even sometimes families would have their own nuts. So you would have, every village has a little shrine also for the nuts where you can donate to them. And this has nothing to do with Buddhism per se, and Buddhist monks would not really like that, because it's not, but it's a sort of syncretism where these both religions live within the people at the same time. Maybe another, what also goes to show that how important religion is that it by now it is probably the biggest institution in the country, in the sense that I think it's estimates, I think, about 400,000 people are monks. You have a total population of 55 million, and you have around 500,000 people that are monks and nuns. And this is various reasons, because it is at least one way to secure food for your child. So if you're a very poor family, giving your child into a monastery might just be the way to make sure that your child is being fed. At the same time, many monks or monasteries also take over roles that we in Europe are used to see being done by the state, right? So education sometimes happens in monasteries, healthcare happens in monasteries, because the state has neglected all of these under military rule massively. So this all plays a big role, and is central to people's beliefs. And you see it also in the military. The military has styled itself, especially since the 90s, when they went away from the socialism, as they don't call themselves Buddhist kings, but they act like them in a way. Even Minamline, the current commander-in-chief and self-declared dictator, he's been building, I think, the largest, marble Buddha statue in the country, or even in Southeast Asia, I don't know. But again, like using funds of a very poor country to build some massive statue, like Buddhist kings and nobility used to do over centuries.
Is this in Naypyidaw, like in the capital?
This is in the new capital, Naypyidaw.
In the new capital, yes, which is also a kind of also has this sort of monarchical touch to it, with these
absolutely
extremely big highways, extremely big buildings. Extremely.
Yeah, that's right. And they built the statues of the kings, of three central kings that in their historical narrative unified the country, and they built them everywhere in the country, no matter if they actually ruled in these parts or not. So they're building this historical narrative and that present themselves as a continuation of that. Then to come to the non-Buddhist part of the country, so especially in some of these very high regions, Buddhism never was really spread, and there were animist beliefs of various kinds. And when European missionaries arrived there, they were much more lucky or successful than Buddhist missionaries before them, which also has to do that some of the animist myths or stories that they had fit much better with Christianity. So there was maybe some creator father at the top, the Quran in the Southeast even had some story that a white brother would bring back a lost book. So when a missionary, a white guy, came with a book, the Bible, it fell on fertile ground, so to say. So you have a part, especially in the north, the Kachin, and in the southeast, about a bit less than half of the Karen population is Christian, mostly Baptists of various kinds, some Catholics as well in Kachin. But that's the Christian population. And then you have a Muslim population, which you have spread across the country. So during colonial rule, until 1937, Burma was part of British India. So it was ruled as one country, more or less. It was a province of India. And so there was massive migration from India during this years, because Burma was a bit richer than many parts of India. And many of these immigrants were Muslims. And so you have in many cities or towns all across the country, you have substantial Indian minority or of Indian heritage. But they've been there for centuries. Some of them were already there even before colonial times, but we don't need to go into much details now. And then you have, as a specific, let's say, subgroup of that, you have the Rohingya that are sort of confined to the west in what is now known as Rakhine State. It was used to be called Arakan, and that is a very contested history, where whatever you say, you will be attacked by people who are invested in that matter. But the thing is that this area, this kingdom, also in pre-colonial times, was always more oriented towards the Indian subcontinent and towards the inner part of the country. So it was always a mixed Buddhist-Muslim kingdom, although the king was himself Buddhist. And they partially, for example, also ruled over Chittagong, which is now part of Bangladesh. And the Rohingya are a population that speaks its own language that is very closely related to Chittagonian, and they lived confined in this area in the kingdom of Arakan or Rakhine State. And so they are not spread across the country in the same manner as these other Indian migrants that I mentioned before. And also here we see what I mentioned before in the 1940s during World War II, the Rohingya, they didn't use the name that vastly as they do now, but also called them Rohingya, fought on the side of the British, whereas the Rakhine population, they fought on the side of the Japanese. And so also there we have massacres and a bit of a, where what before was more intermixed between these ethnicities, that they were more split, where the north was then populated by Rohingya and the south more by Buddhists. And the specific aspect here is that they are termed as Bengali in a derogatory manner, saying because the Burmese nationalists want to say they do not belong here. They are illegal immigrants. Sometimes they claim that they were illegal immigrants in the 1970s after the war of independence of Bangladesh. There is nothing to substantiate that in any bigger number. But that's basically the core problem. And here, and this comes now sort of to the second question also, the fact that they are Muslim plays a big role, because Islam has been more and more seen as a threat to Buddhism, especially in Myanmar. As if you remember the map, you basically have Myanmar as the westernmost country of the Southeast Asian mainland, which is predominantly Buddhist, of different confessions, but Buddhist. And while Buddhism originated in India, many parts of India have been Islamicized in that sense. And many people in Myanmar see it, especially those Buddhist nationalists, in a sense, as Myanmar being the Western gate against the Islamic world. And if you remember, the Taliban blew up these huge Buddha statues that was also received very strongly in Myanmar, and other parts of Southeast Asia that used to be Buddhist that were Islamicized. So there are these aspects to it where it's not only about the ethnicity of the Rohingya, but also about their religious faith. And when it comes to Christians, when the Union of Burma was founded in 1948, it was nominally a secular state, and there was no official religion in that sense. And I think, to answer that question briefly, what you said, I think the religious aspect exacerbates the ethnic conflict. It's not purely. I think the ethnic component is more important, because you have a lot of ethnicities that are Buddhist that are also resisting, right? Like the Shan, they're very Buddhist. The Hmong are Buddhist. But the Kachin, for example, and here is a good example how religion plays into that. The Kachin were one of those signatories of that agreement that I mentioned in 1947. So they didn't pick up arms right away, because they still believed in the Constitution, and sort of maybe even that which was not good about the Constitution could be rectified with political means. But in 1961, UNU, so shortly before the military coup, the central government declared Buddhism the state religion, because UNU was a very devout Buddhist. He was the prime minister from 1948 until 1962. And that it was not the only reason, but played a major role for the Kachin Independence Army to form, which is fighting until today and fighting very intensely now again. Because they felt this is the final betrayal of the agreement we had, because we are not even sticking to a secular state, you're now making this even a Buddhist state. So we're going to pick up arms. So we can see that religion plays a role of exacerbation of the conflicts, and we have a lot of religious discrimination in the past decades, and it's in Myanmar, when you have your national ID, it says both your ethnicity, could be 5 if you're mixed. It's quite insane, and then it says your religion.
Incredible. All right, I see. Interesting. But despite all this division, it seemed like, at least starting from the late 80s, early 90s, the whole country kind of came together behind the figure of Aung San Suu Kyi. She kind of assumed this role as mother of the nation, also given her family relations. As you mentioned before, she was the daughter of General Aung San. So yeah, I mean, we kind of know how it turned out. Her attempts at, of course, building a military-less democracy in Myanmar, which have been, as I said before, thwarted definitely in 2021, despite the situation being already very hard before that. We had from what I understand, a constitution which pretty much did not allow her to, or made it impossible for her to become president. So there was a whole a big attempt at trying to give her some other sort of authority, and then the elections came in late 2020, and that was then the end of it. Can you talk a bit more about, like, her role again as mother of the nation in this terms of unifying figure, and also what is her situation today? Where is she at, and what? Yeah.
So Aung San Suu Kyi was, as you said, the daughter of Aung San, which is important because she also she looks like him a lot. And I mean, he's the most prominent figure he's the most prominent hero, at least for the majority population. And she actually had lived abroad. She had married an Englishman and was living in the UK, had 2 kids. But in the late 80s, in 88, she returned to Burma because her mother was sick and she had to take care of her. And while she was there, the 1988 uprising began, which was the biggest uprising since 1962 against the military. And it was brutally shot down. And probably we'll never know the exact number, but thousands of people were murdered by the military with atrocious stories that you can hear from survivors. But the point was that she was in the country and she was approached by young activists and asked to take the lead of the central democracy movement, which culminated in the National League for Democracy, her party. And so she became an incredibly important figure. But you said that she was sort of, I would not say that she was. It's a bit that narrative that everyone stood behind her, and that is absolutely true especially for the, I think, majority population, where she had massive support until today, and also to a substantial part of the different ethnic groups, but not as much as within the majority population. So I wouldn't say that she completely unified the country, and you still had, all these rebel groups, this resistance groups, they still existed. They didn't listen to her command or anything, so they still existed, and there is also, that's a detailed question, of course, but how much she understood of the ethnic problem. If you read her texts, I have to say, like in her texts that are collected in the book Freedom from Fear, I don't think that at least it was that important to her as it should have been. And it was this approach that was long taken by her and other elites from the central, from the majority: democracy first, and then we can talk about everything else, like federalism, and also the way they conducted their rule from 2015 to 2020, that didn't give a different picture either. So, but she rose to extreme prominence, and she was put under house arrest during most of the 90s and 2000s. And she rose to prominence also in the West because she got the Nobel Peace Prize. This was initiated by Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, or he was one of the initiators. He supported it. I don't think he initiated it, but anyway, that gave her a big role. And of course, it was a nice story. You have this one lady that is standing up to the generals, and to an extent, it's also true. I mean, she forfeited. Her husband got sick. He got cancer in the 90s. And she had her 2 kids in the UK, and the military said, you can leave. But she knew that if she left, she couldn't return to Burma, and she didn't want to do that. So she, in that way, also this sacrifice that she made in the 1990s, although other people were imprisoned and treated much harsher than her in house arrest, but still gave her a very strong aura of a very charismatic leader. And so she was released, and I think 2010 she was finally released from house arrest. And the military had drafted a new constitution over the 90s and early 2000s, which you could say was partially democratic, but only partially. It allowed the military it allowed some parts of government institutions to be run by civilians nominally, but it retained for the military a very strong position. So, for example, 25% seats of all parliaments in the country were reserved for the military. So when you had elections under this constitution, the people would only elect the 75% that were remaining, right? So 25% would be picked by the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The armed forces were not under civilian command, and 3 core ministries were also controlled by the military. So, and then there is a lot of other aspects, right? As I said, they controlled the economy totally, and there was a lot of, there's what is written in the constitution, and there's what is going on behind closed doors.
Right.
But nevertheless, in 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy, they contested these elections, they won the vast majority, and the military actually allowed them to rule during these years. Although she, as you also correctly said, she could not be president because there is a clause in the constitution that forbids people who have foreign spouses to be the president. And I mean, it is basically the Aung San Suu Kyi clause, although her name doesn't appear, but it was specifically made for her, I think.
Right.
Yeah, but when my feeling is that the military never wanted to give up power. They never wanted to really share power, and they saw that even under this constitution, which they drafted, the NLD would win the elections, and because they had a proxy party. Yeah, there's a party that is basically made up of former military generals or their cronies, and they would only need to win 25% of seats in parliament, right, to form the government, because they could cooperate with the military. But they didn't even manage to get these seats, right? So they underestimated how unpopular they are in the country. And I think when this happened the second or third time in 2020, they thought like, oh no, we messed up the constitution in the sense we didn't give us enough power. That was one reason, I think, and that's why they staged a coup, because they didn't feel that they had enough power over the country, although they had by most observers said, a very comfortable position, because it was impossible to change the constitution within the constitutional system.
Right. Well, I mean, it seems like most of Burmese politics are kind of permeated by the fact that the country has been under a military dictatorship for the last 50 years. It seems like it's so sticky in transitions, in the sense that it's really, really hard for people to let go of power, and also you have to build democratic institutions from zero. It's not like you're snapping back to a pre-existing democracy or something like that. You have to build everything from zero.
Yeah, that's correct.
I see. Very interesting. Let's move back to kind of bridging back to more recent events. Let's talk about the role of China and that China has had in the last years, and also in the latest months. It seems like until now, the military in Myanmar has kind of enjoyed a sort of blank check from Beijing, in the sense that they've been providing weapons, military equipment, but also support. And but things have seem to have been changing in the last months. What is that about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question whether it's been changing or we have or it's been misrepresented. I think I personally, so there are other people who know this much better than me. But I'm lucky to have a very good friend who studies this and who's helped me out with this. But China's role is much more complex and less monolithic than it is usually portrayed. And I think that's probably true for the discussion about China in general. But when it comes to Myanmar, you have a core Chinese interest that is strategic and economic. If you look at the map, and maybe I will share the map here again to make this better understandable. If we look at the at the location of Myanmar. So you have China here, and if you look, it has its ports are all here on its east coast, right? And the way, as I understand, most ships routes take to Europe is here through the south and here through the Straits of Malacca in Singapore, right? And the fear is one of the fears that China has is, as I understand, is in the case of a major war against the US, that the US could easily close down these straits here, and then they lose access to basically, the Indian Ocean. And when we go back into Myanmar, this route here is the short to the Gulf of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. And they want, one of the biggest projects is here in Chapyu, they want to build a deep sea port. And this deep sea port would not only be usable for commercial aspects, but also military. That's what is been thought of. So that's one reason. And you also already have a gas and oil pipeline that roughly runs from the coast here of Rakhine to Kunming in Yunnan. So basically, that's strategic, also military and strategic and economically strategic interest that China has in the country. And then, of course, as Myanmar was, especially in the past 10 years, or before the coup, a booming economy, it was, of course, also a place where they could sell their stuff and invest in. And here you also see that China has different players, because when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not one exact plan that China has, but you have different players within China that influence that. You have the central government, of course, but you have the provincial governments. So Yunnan here has its own interests. The huge state-owned enterprises have their own interests. The military has its own interests. That they're partially competing within this Belt and Road Initiative, and competing interests in Myanmar. And then there is the aspect that, so our natural inclination would be, okay, China is an authoritarian state, so they support authoritarian rule in Myanmar. And this is partially true. They have given them cover in international fora, the Security Council, amongst others, and most importantly in the Security Council. They have been the largest provider of weapons until recently. Now they are on par, I think, roughly with Russia. And so they are important, but at the same time, the generals in Myanmar have a very unreliable partners for the Chinese. The generals are xenophobic, not only against the Muslims, but against everyone, and that includes China. There's a strong xenophobia against China. They don't like to be dependent on one country like this. They don't want to have a strong Chinese influence. And this is one reason, actually, why in the past, say, 1 or 2 decades, they have switched and tried to build stronger ties to Russia. Because, of course, there is no common border with Russia. So it's far away up here in the north. So the direct interests of Russia are much smaller, of course, in that sense than those of China. And that's why the military has tried to build a stronger alliance with Russia. And also, in that sense, that the generals have been unreliable, because they, even in their rule, they do not just do what China wants. So one of the previously biggest projects of China was to build a dam. So here we are now in the north. You see Myitkyina, which is the capital of Kachin State in the north, and you have the border here to Yunnan province of China, and a bit north of Myitkyina. Here you see here the 2 rivers, the Mai and Mai Ka River, have a confluence, which is called Myitsone, and that forms the Irrawaddy, which then flows down the whole country, right? So there are millions of people, tens of millions of people that rely on this water. There was a plan to build a dam there, a massive hydropower dam, which would have affected tens of millions of people downstream. And that plan was approved in the early 2000s. But there were massive protests against this. And so the military at the time in 2009 I think it was in 2009, or was it 2013? Don't quote me on that. Point is, the military rule suspended the project overnight because they feared the protests. And that was a big slap in the face of China. I mean, they just, they had contracts and everything. China could probably drag them to the World Trade Organization over that. They haven't done that, but and thwarted the project. So this just to illustrate that the generals are not a reliable partner that China probably wants to see in Myanmar. And when Aung San Suu Kyi was in power, the CCP, the Communist Party of China, the government of China was trying to strengthen its ties to Aung San Suu Kyi a lot, because they understood, I guess, that she has a lot of also moral influence within the country. So if there were big Chinese economic projects in the country and she says they are okay, the chance that they would be accepted by the population would be much higher. So you can't say that the Chinese are always on the side of the authoritarian generals when it comes to Myanmar, of course.
Right.
And after the coup, the first statements that came out of China were more or less, we are not happy to see this, which for Chinese standards is very much like, this is not good. And so it was much more neutral than it was perceived. I think that I have the feeling that the Chinese still think that the military is going to hold on, and they don't think that the revolution has a proper chance to win, which is why they have tried to stick with the military to an extent. But I don't think that is something that is totally set in stone. It depends a bit on the diplomatic feeling of the revolution, if they can do that. And if you allow me a last comment on this, China has always played a double role. And on the one hand, they have supported the military in the center, but all these, especially so there were several along the Chinese border. There are several ethnic resistance organizations that have the headquarters there. Kachin, the MNDAA that we mentioned, the TNLA, I don't think it's directly at the border, but there's several groups, and they exist also because they can get weapons through the Chinese border, right? So China has some influence on these. So it has always played both roles. They sort of supported the military rulers, but at the same time also supported different armed insurgent groups that could destabilize the country.
So could it be that? So wait, did I get this right? You think that China is somehow giving the ethnic armed organizations some leeway to hinder the efforts of the People's Defense Forces and indirectly, therefore, the national unity government? Or...
No. So many of these. So for example, if we take the Kachin Independence Army has its headquarters around here. I think is Liza. Here, this is Liza. This is the headquarters of the Kachin Independence Army, directly at the border, and they are allied with the resistance. They play a central part of the resistance, and they cooperate with the national unity government, which is the revolutionary government and the political leadership of the revolution as a whole. So they are not trying to undermine the resistance, but the fact that these groups exist on these borders, and this predates the coup. I'm trying to say is that the Chinese allow them to arm themselves, allow them to be there, not on the Chinese side, but that this gives them influence in the conflict in Myanmar, right? And this is something that the generals have resented a lot, because they say basically China is supporting resistance to the central state. And there is always a debate about how much influence China has over these groups. I mean, you have the WA, for example, the United Wa State Army, which is actually the biggest armed resistance group. They rule their own state, more or less. I mean, they have 20 to 30,000 soldiers. No Burmese soldier dares to get its foot in there. They have anti-aircraft weaponry. They have some form of small infantry fighting vehicles and stuff like that. And they use the Chinese currency and everything. They still say themselves that they are part of Myanmar, but it's roughly here, I think. So right. China plays a double role in everything.
Yeah, that seems to be the case here as well. But nevertheless, it seems like in the past, China's always tried to keep the border with Myanmar as stable as possible to some extent.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it almost seems like and this is my opinion, it almost seems like they're kind of willing to endure, let's say, some short-term instability on the border in exchange or to secure some long-term economic and strategic interests in the country. I mean, because
Yeah.
it almost looks like a blackmail to the military somehow, you know. But of course, this is speculation. Don't take my word for this.
And don't take my word either. Like to understand Chinese foreign policy is very difficult, and also to understand their understanding of the conflict is very difficult. But yeah, it's I leave this usually to people who know better than me.
Right, and so to press you more on this subject, is this the end of military rule in Myanmar?
Ask a historian to make predictions.
I mean? Yeah, of course. This is my favorite activity. Yes.
Yeah. I certainly would hope so.
I'm exaggerating, of course, but definitely it seems like this is the biggest setback in years.
Yeah, I mean, so this offensive itself is, of course, not the end of military rule, but what it does show, I think, is what many have said from the beginning, that the threat for the military of ending its rule is very real, much more real than it has been in decades, probably since I don't know, since the 60s, because, as I said before, the military has always managed to split the various kinds of opposition. And that was, of course, aided, say, after 88, you had no internet, you had no community. What I said before about the infrastructure of the country, that was even worse in the late 80s and early 90s, right? So you wouldn't know what was happening in Kachin State when you were down in Karen State at the Thai border, right? It was just, you could not coordinate. Now you have a revolutionary government and all these, they debate the future constitution through Zoom, right? I mean, there's right. and you have a completely different information flow. So that alone is a big shift. So far, I mean, many people point out that not everyone is part of the national unity government and so on, and not officially declared to this or that side. But at the same time, I think there is for Myanmar standards, is a very strong unity, and you have some cooperation on the ground, as we have seen now. And the military has no. It seems quite clear to me that they don't have the military means to fight back, to regain lost territory. If you compare this to 2015, when the same groups, in a more limited extent, tried to gain control in the same areas that we see now, they did not. They were quickly defeated and by the military, who was able to bring in new forces and push them back. They have no chance of this now, because they're fighting on all fronts. And as soon as this started, other parts of the country started to intensify their attacks on the military as well. And if maybe I can illustrate this with another map, or with two maps.
Definitely, yeah.
About territorial control. Is this the correct one? Yeah. So this was the rough situation in February 2022, so over 1.5 years ago. What I have to say, so this is a very strong approximation again. What we see here, basically, what is the green, the vast green part, this is where the military is said to have at least substantial control. And you again see like this, the plains in the middle and the big cities, they're all more or less under control of the military. This was and also these borders are not straightforward, right? The military, basically, when it doesn't have troops deployed anywhere, they have very little control over it. But we can see here, and this map is actually, in that sense, well done. What we see here, for example, is the Chin State area, very mountainous, infrastructurally very underdeveloped. There are barely any roads. But you can see that that the map maker Thomas von Linge, who I want to give credit to here, you see these green stripes. These are basically the main roads, right, and the main towns. But the military was unable to move outside of these, and military convoys would take months for trips that usually would take maybe a few days, because they were constantly attacked from the highland jungles, right? So this, and in many of these areas, maybe the military could come, burn down a few villages as they usually do, and then they would have to retreat again. So it's not that clear cut who is in control and who not. Anyways, it does give you some idea of the situation. And when I give you the map now for the current situation, you see how you see the change between the two, right? How the areas of control of various resistance groups have extended massively, especially here in Sagaing, but also so the offensive that we're talking about was taking place here, where you had the different groups having smaller territories in a year and a half ago, and now they've managed to take up much more control in that. And if we look down here, this is Karenni, what I mentioned. There is currently, this is the capital city of Karenni state, which is already 50% under resistance control. And so what I want to say with this is that as it seemed, what this shows is, I think, that the military is under immense pressure. And again, it is, we see a development. As I said, they started with roadside bombs. They started with, especially here in the Northwest, a lot of people had very old handheld guns, like rifles, one-shot rifles, basically muskets from 19th century almost. And by now, they have they've developed so far that they could even take small towns under control. This is not enough to take a city, right? Still, but we see a constant development where the military was, even in the beginning when they were not well armed, the military was unable to defeat them. And to bring in another aspect of this is, if you let me find the right picture quickly. When it comes to this, so not here, sorry, to the weaponry, big part is, of course, the fact that every convoy that is attacked by the resistance in one way or another, all these weapons that they gain can be used. And during the recent offensive, these weapon hauls have taken a completely different level. And what we see here is just a recent when they took over a camp, and you see massive amounts of assault rifles and artillery shells and small scale artillery and larger machine guns, etc.
Right. Right.
And that, you know, a lot of the resistance forces in many parts of the country, they have more men than they have arms. So maybe a third or half of the people would have arms. And with these hauls, actually the ranks of the resistance grow by the mere fact that more people will have a gun in their hand that they can use. And so a lot points to the fact that the military is losing ground. Now, that being said, there is still a long way ahead, right? It's very difficult to take a large city.
Right.
The main aspect will be, can the military remain its cohesion, or can the resistance remain its cohesion? And who stays stronger together and united will have the upper hand at some point. Because for soldiers, so far, the calculation, you know, a military soldier will have a very personal calculation, not only a moral one, thinking, will I be better off staying in the military with my family, or will I be better off outside? And now that so many of them are dying, and the chances of them being sent to the front and to be killed, this calculation changes. And we've seen since this offensive much larger defections than we have seen before. So we can hope that this continues. So it depends also on psychological warfare, how good the resistance will be able to make use of that.
Right. Of course, this is we will have to only wait and see.
Yeah.
One last question before we leave, which is a curiosity of mine. Before we head to a close, you said that these groups often capture weapons and armor from the army, and indeed, it seems like most of the financing from these resistance groups are grassroots funded. A lot of them seem to have a strong base in the country, but also from the Burmese diaspora outside of Myanmar. Are there any other actors that push money and funds into the resistance from outside? Non-state actors from other countries or countries themselves?
Unfortunately not. I mean, and that's been a quite disappointing aspect of all of this is the international reaction. I mean, we can talk about it, of course, like giving money to or delivering weapons is a completely different thing when it comes to Myanmar and when it comes to Ukraine. We don't have a border. We don't have, but there are many ways, in my view, where we could have and still could support the resistance from the outside. If I'm speaking of governments now or of states that have an interest. The EU had massively invested in development projects in Myanmar in the years prior, and unfortunately they have not continued to do. They've basically stopped everything, which on the one hand is good because you don't want to cooperate with the military, but they have not taken up the chance to cooperate with the revolutionary government. I mean, for example, most of the people that work for this revolutionary government are volunteers. It's very hard to run the government on volunteers, right? So we could have continued to support them through these programs and at least finance the people that work for them, to have a staff. I met the human rights minister. He was here in Vienna. I organized a visit for him. Basically, I had to do it because they don't have the capacities to organize it themselves. And he had, I think, 7 volunteers in this ministry. I mean, give them that chance, allow them to open offices like the Czech Republic has done. So the Energy has a representative office in Prague. This could be done much more widely. You could support their education moves. I mean, there are tens of thousands of kids who already, because of COVID, were basically outside the school system, and then they started boycotting the central system because they didn't want to have what they call the military slave education. Many of these ethnic resistance organizations, they have their own ministries of education. They have their own schools. Their numbers have swelled. There is a Ministry of Education in the National Unity Government funded. We provided 200 million euros for educational reform in Myanmar before the coup. Why do we not give these people that are actually now providing education for the kids in Myanmar the money? Because we are so afraid, because this is a non-state actor, although it is a legitimate government in my view. So this is all connected also to the question of who is the government of Myanmar. We could provide them with intelligence like satellite imagery. You could provide them with Starlink or other satellite internet systems, would be very useful in these remote regions, right? So there would be many options, but as it is now, and this makes, I would say, the gains of the resistance all the more impressive. It is basically financed by the people in the country and the diaspora. And this, despite the fact that it's a very poor country, and despite the fact that weapons are very expensive in this part of the world. Just to give you a notion, it's an assault rifle, as far as I know, is anything between 1.5 and 2,000 and 3,000 euros or dollars on the black market, to which Myanmar has access. And the minimum wage when I was there was I think €3.50. So right. I mean that's for some people that's more than a yearly income to just buy an assault rifle, and you see how much gains they have made through that, and that I think shows the vast support that the resistance, and I don't want to idealize everything. There have been the problematic aspects of the armed resistance as well, of course, but but the vast support that they have in the country, I think, is shown by the fact that they can sustain themselves. These are tens of thousands of fighters all across the country. You cannot live if the population doesn't support you with money, with food, shelter at times as well.
Right.
While maybe just to make this point even more severe, the military has been actively supported, especially by Russia.
Right. We've seen in delivery of fighter jets as well. And as you explained before, the morphology of the country and the vegetation has kind of induced the military to adopt these extremely cruel and brutal airstrike tactics, which, it's enough to. There is a website, I believe it's kept up by Cambridge, I believe it's called, or the ISS. Myanmar War Monitor, which keeps track of all the airstrikes that have been going on in the country, and they're an incredible number. I was honestly shocked when I saw those figures.
And they bomb schools, they bomb health clinics that are placed in liberated territory. They have absolutely no. I mean, the military's tactic has been for decades now to basically go after the civilian population that supports whatever, or that they think supports whatever resistance group there is. The Rohingya crisis was just the largest such operation, where they burned down, I think, 400 villages at least partially, and massacred thousands of people. But that was nothing new. It was just new in the scale, so to say, that the Rohingya had to face in 2017. But I mean, the same tactics are applied all across the country. Thousands of houses, I think tens of thousands of houses have been burned down. Some people, I think Myanmar Witness is another good resource for this kind of numbers. You have, I think, almost 2 million internally displaced people. We don't hear about them enough because, if a refugee doesn't cross a border, people don't care much about it because no one else is bothered. And the military is using that as a weapon as well. And we have also failed to. This is another area where we could do very good if we cooperated with local organizations that have access to these refugees. But because of the overboarding bureaucracy that, for example, EU aid has, these small organizations can't ask for that money because they don't have the time to file all these reports and collect all these receipts and whatever is required. And they've been complaining about this for a long time, and there's not enough movement there, unfortunately, either. So there's a lot of private support needed.
Yeah, I see. Well, I mean, 2 million is a big number. I mean, considering you said, that's like, it's almost 4% of the population. If you 3.5% of the population. And this is not including the refugees that have actually found their way into Bangladesh.
No, there's another million there. Yeah, and there are some in Thailand and all across the world. But yeah,
right. Well, Georg, we're approaching the 1.5 hour mark. I wouldn't want to abuse more of your precious time. Thanks a lot for the chat. Really, this has been extremely helpful in having a more comprehensive view of the civil war in Myanmar and also of Myanmar's history. Thank you again. And I think as a first address to the Italian public, I was very satisfied by your comments. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for having me again and for bringing light to the situation.
All right, then have a good day.
Ciao.